Hello everyone. My work focuses on human overpopulation, but in the interest of this conference I will also be addressing immigration and its relationship to our exceedingly large numbers. By the end of this presentation I hope I have persuaded you into thinking about what a restrictive immigration policy looks like when taking into account the environmental degradation that both human overpopulation and immigration can cause. So let's get right into it. You might be wondering by now why human overpopulation when we have so many other environmental issues to worry about. When we have climate change, biodiversity loss, glaciers melting, oceans acidifying, pollution and deforestation and many others. What I want to show you is that human overpopulation is behind all of these problems, and immigration will be as well. As Sir Chris Thickel says, the proliferation of our species is one of our most important problems, but it's not alone. Last year, a committee of 50 Nobel Prizes were asked what would be the greatest challenge for humanity in the coming years. And their answer, as you can see, was population rise and the environmental degradation that comes from it. But what does a human overpopulation look like? This is what it looks like. As you can see, from the entirety of human history, our numbers were always quite stable. But after the 1900s, the population started exploding. And when we look at 1927, when we reached 2 billion, the population in less than 100 years has almost quadrupled. When we take into account why is this, we must look into the fertility rates all over the world and see that there is a huge discrepancy in this regard. As you look into Europe, the United States and other developed countries, you can see that the fertility rate has stabilized at around 1.5 to 2 or 3. This means that the population has slowly stabilized and is now growing very slowly or even reducing. When we look at Africa, for example, we see that in Central and West Africa, the fertility rates are much higher. And until the end of this century, this will mean that the continent itself would add 2 billion people to those countries. If you remember the last slide, I told you that it took until 1927 for humanity to reach 2 billion. And now, by the end of this century, Africa alone will add 2 billion people to its continent. This is a continent that is already stressed in the resources, fresh water, food security, and ravaged by conflict. We know that all of these people will climate change will deal a lot of damage in this continent, and they will naturally look somewhere else to be relocated. So population rise is at the root of migration issues. But I want to start by telling you about some of the main impacts of population rise. As you see from this graph, we know that as humans rise on the planet, this atmospheric CO2 concentrations rise as well. And why is this? Because each and every one of us, by the sheer fact that is living, has a carbon footprint. Of course, these carbon footprints change all over the world, but the fact remains that each and every one of us needs energy, we need agriculture, something to eat, something to dress, and all of these activities have repercussions in terms of environmental impact. As I told you, these changes all over the world, and here in Poland, for example, the average metric ton per capita is 7.5. As you can see in Central and West Africa, again, that number doesn't rise above 0.7. So we know that in developed nations, those metrics are a lot higher. And that changes as well, and that's a very important argument in the immigration policy that I'm going to talk to you about later. But before moving on to other impacts from overpopulation, I want to show you this graph that tells us what in the Paris Climate Accord was established as a 2-ton metric ton degree goal for each and every one of us and the entire world to live sustainably. As you remember from the last slide, Poland had an average of 7.5. This means that in 2013 already 80% of nations were above that threshold. So that's a lot of problems for the entire world, and to avert the 2 degrees Celsius warm of the planet that we are trying to avert. As you see, developed nations have much higher carbon emissions, and the tendency is for humanity to move to the left, since we are getting richer and we are adding more people to the planet. Next up, we have urbanization. Since you know that each and every one of us requires a house, we require infrastructures, roads, and services. All of these asphalt and cement will take from nature, from ecosystems, so we can occupy that surface for ourselves and our activities. One of those examples comes from Bangalore in India, where you can see in the last 40 years how the landscape has changed completely. In 1973, the city was almost entirely covered by vegetation, and is now completely the reverse. We now have a city covered by asphalt and cement, and this is a result of population growth and people moving into the cities looking for a better life. Next up, we have agriculture. We know that by increasing our population, each and every one of us needs to eat. And there are differences in affluence all over the world. Different people eat more and have a carbon footprint and ecological footprint attached. When we add more people to the world, we through agriculture, we also transmogrify the landscape and the ecosystems, and we are taking from nature to transform it into a human factory, basically. And this process leads to a lot of ecological impacts that we are now only figuring out, and will certainly uncover through the next years more of these problems. This year and the one before, we discovered that the insect abundance in Europe alone, which the European Union at the moment dedicates 46% of its land surface to agriculture, and this transmogrification of the landscape has led to a fall of the insects, which serve as nourishment for the ecological trophic cascades that affect a lot of other species. We have farmland birds that were just discovered some weeks ago, are decreasing in a lot of countries in Europe, and as well as farm birds, we have also bats that are decreasing as well, and this will certainly continue because of the amount of fertilizers and pesticides that are used to maintain the yields that are necessary to feed the growing population in Europe. Moving on, we have the livestock population problem, which is the other population problem that comes with humans. As we now see, livestock and all of the crops that are dedicated to feed them occupy 27% of the world's surface land area, which is superior to forests, which occupy 26%. As the voracious appetite of humans and the number of humans are increasing on this planet, we know that forests are being attacked and replaced to be able to feed these livestock. On the other image, you have what you can see is the total land mass, land weight of all of the vertebrates on the world. 10,000 years ago, it used to be 1% of humans on the planet and 99% of wild animals. That situation has completely been reversed. Now we have about 1.5 of wild animals on the planet, and the rest of the biomass or weight is occupied by all of the humans and all of the domesticated species such as sheep, chickens, pigs, cattle that we use to feed ourselves and our growing population. And finally, we have a very important fact that is in a planet with finite resources and finite space, with a growing population, we have to admit that not all of the places on this planet will have the same abundance of resources, and many ecosystems have already overshoot their carrying capacities, and this will eventually lead to a lot of suffering and misery for humanity and for other species. But in a changing world with climate change and all of these impacts, we know that people will be displaced. Several sources name different numbers of humans being displaced by all of these impacts and changes from climate change, for example. And as Joseph Romm says, If the world were to increase in warmth, which is most likely by now, we would probably adapt, but that wouldn't mean that a number close to 2 billion people wouldn't have to move. And these numbers of climate refugees would be a catastrophe. We saw 2 to 3 million people from Syria turn global politics upside down. So when we think about the hundreds of refugees, climate refugees that will probably be on the move in the future, we have to prepare for a really civilizational challenge. And this leads us from overpopulation to migration. Should immigration restriction be used as a policy instrument for environmental improvement? This assertion is divided into several premises. And for this exercise, I will use the United States because they have studied this immigration affair for longer and they have more data. First of all, immigration levels are at an historical high, and it is now the main driver of population growth in many countries, developed countries such as in Europe and the United States. As you can see, the tendency has been for the number of immigrants to rise in the United States, and it is now in 2016, the number was 43.6 million people in this decade alone. So the same is happening in Europe. As you can see, natural change, which is births minus death, is decreasing, which means that more people are dying in Europe than being born. And net immigration has replaced natural change as the main factor of growing. In terms of ethical, environmental ethics, the scenario that would be most recognizable for and positive for the environment would be for developed countries to decrease their populations. So having a net migration so high and increasing the footprint of these countries is not the most desirable scenario. So finally, we have to see under this premise that migration does a lot of impacting population dynamics. We see that under these projections, if the United States, for example, adopted a zero policy scenario, its population would start to decrease until 2100. If, on the other hand, that migration quota were to be elevated to 2 million from the 1.5 million that it's currently at the moment, the population of the United States will double from its current location. So this leads us to premise number 2. Population growth is significantly instrumental in an assortment of environmental problems within the borders of a country. This is what I was talking to you about when mentioning urbanization, the agriculture, the finitude of resources. So we know that these and many other problems are created by an excess of humans in a given location. So this premise has already been proved on the previous slides. So we can move on to the third premise. A burgeoning population expands a country's large environmental footprint. We know that international migrants have been moving from low-income countries to middle or higher-income countries. This means that most of these countries have a lower ecological footprint or carbon footprint as well. And by moving from a lower income to a higher income, people, as Palmer says, immigrants who relocate themselves in America, for example, reasonably will aspire to adopt a standard of living in America. This entails becoming American consumers, which increases energy use, carbon emissions, and other problems for the environment, and eventually leading to new ones because the consumption of resources changes so much on the entire world. As you can see from the image below, the World Bank states that China, India, and the United States, when taking into account the population and the consumption altogether, are the top most polluters in the world. So this premise states that the ecological footprints change, and when people change from one location that they have lower impact to one that has higher consumption behaviors, they will probably adopt those behaviors, changing the environmental impact that people have in the world. So this premise leads us to, in order to seriously address environmental problems domestically and become good global citizens, we must reduce population growth, as I said before. Therefore, there should be limitations to immigration into the developed and affluent countries in order to curtail population growth and the escalation of these huge human ecological footprints. To not leave just this on the ether and provide some policies as well, I would suggest that in terms of policies domestically, there would be a scaling down of immigration from more than 1 million to 2,000 per year in the case of the United States. This would allow for people that are looking for a better life to still being able to relocate in that country, and refugees, climate refugees and political refugees to still look for asylum in these countries. But the truth is we have to reduce the quotas in terms of legal immigration and as well as illegal immigration, because there would need to be a strictly enforcing sanctions against employers who hire illegal immigrants for work. Finally, ending tax incentives for families to have big families and a larger family size. In terms of foreign policy, these two would also be adopted internally and on those countries, but there would be an increase in the funding for international family planning efforts to help secure access to contraception in those countries. Also vigorously supporting reproductive rights, including abortion rights and girls' equal rights on other countries and other nations, as well as providing primary and secondary education to girls. As a project Drawdown, which tried to put solutions to climate change by order of effectiveness, they came to the conclusion that educating girls and family planning would be the 6 and 7 most efficient solutions to counter climate change. Altogether, they are our #1 priority right now to fighting climate change. So in order to tackle also climate change and overpopulation, as well as migration, we all need to focus on these 2 solutions. Finally, and this one is very important, which is denying foreign aid as well as migration slots to nations that fail to compromise into decreasing their populations and trying to maintain or control their population, their fertilities in the country, or sharing the wealth fairly among its citizens. As Kefauver and Staples III says, such policies would make a resounding statement that the age of endless growth has come to an end, and that developed nations are serving as a safety valve for failed and unjust societies that cannot or will not arrange for decent opportunities for their citizens. I leave you with the quote for Karen Schregg, that overpopulation hurts women, impairs prosperity, and condemns people to live in a world of poverty, robbing children of a promising future. Also, matching resources with the sustainable demand is deeply humane and is the only way to achieve that is by voluntarily lowering fertility rates all over the world. Thank you so much for